My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with anger. From the other side of the fence, her eyes were still on me, as if I were the plague of the neighborhood. The warning signs, written in bold red letters like slash marks, had appeared again this morning for the 23rd time. But there was one thing she didn't know. Every time she tried to push me down, I was one step closer to the truth. And today, she had handed me the final proof. When my front door opened, it wasn't just the police standing there. It was the collapse of the power she once thought was inviolable. I'm Sarah Mitchell, 27, and I just moved into the Willowbrook Gardens community 3 months ago. My neighbors assume I'm a young professional working from home. They don't know that those work sessions include reviewing compliance documents and conducting preliminary investigations into local housing violations. Linda Morrison has been the president of our Homeowners Association for the past 6 years. At 48, she's turned neighborhood patrol into her full-time job. But what Linda Morrison doesn't realize is that her reign of terror is coming to an end, because today's emergency 911 call was the final straw, exposing everything she's been hiding. The whole mess started because I wanted some privacy in my backyard after long days dealing with housing compliance issues. I needed a peaceful space to unwind without feeling like I was living in a fishbowl. My property backed up to 3 other houses, and there wasn't a single spot where I could sit outside without being in full view of my neighbor's windows. After carefully researching both the HOA bylaws and local zoning ordinances, I decided to install a 6-foot privacy fence along my rear property line, which was completely legal according to both sets of regulations. I'd spent hours at the county courthouse reviewing records, making copies, and ensuring every detail of my plan would comply with every possible requirement. The first confrontation happened the moment I started measuring and marking the fence line. Linda Morrison appeared as if she had radar detection for any unapproved activity, marching across the grass in her pink hoodie with that clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes swept over my measuring tape and surveying stakes with the intensity of a detective examining a crime scene. "I'm installing a privacy fence," I replied politely, showing her my carefully prepared notes. "I've already verified it meets all HOA and city requirements." Linda's face immediately began changing colors like a mood ring. "Absolutely not. The HOA doesn't allow fences higher than 4 feet in front and 5 feet in back," she declared with the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "I'm the president of this association, and I know every single rule." I calmly handed her a printed copy of the HOA bylaws I'd downloaded from the county records, pointing to section 7.3, which clearly stated that rear yard fences could be up to 6 feet high if they maintained a minimum 3-foot setback from property boundaries. "I've measured everything precisely to comply with these requirements," I explained, showing her my survey notes and measurements. Her face went from red to purple as she realized I'd actually done my homework, instead of just winging it like most homeowners. "We'll see about this at next month's board meeting," she snapped before storming back to her house, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to come prepared with documentations, citations, and proof that I knew exactly what I was doing. As she retreated, I noticed her furiously writing on her clipboard, no doubt plotting her next move in what would become an escalating war. The harassment escalated dramatically once I started actual construction. Every single day brought a new, formal violation notice slipped under my door or taped to my mailbox with the passive-aggressive precision of someone who'd turned petty tyranny into an art form. The papers were always printed on official HOA letterhead, with bold red text announcing various infractions. The first notice accused me of disturbing the peace with my power tools during perfectly legal daytime hours between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. The second claimed unauthorized construction despite my valid building permit clearly displayed in my front window where anyone could see it. The third hit me with a $200 fine for creating visual obstruction detrimental to community aesthetics, apparently because my half-built fence was somehow destroying property values. I responded to each notice in writing, citing specific laws and regulations, and politely requesting that Mrs. Morrison identify exactly which rule I was violating and provide the legal basis for her claims. My responses were professional, thorough, and backed up with documentation from city codes and state housing laws. But instead of acknowledging my valid points, she only doubled down on her attacks with increasingly creative action. The fourth notice claimed I was creating a fortress-like structure that promotes antisocial behavior. The fifth accused me of undermining neighborhood cohesion through divisive construction practices. By the sixth notice, she was grasping at straws so desperately that she cited me for excessive accumulation of construction materials because I had a small pile of leftover cedar boards in my driveway. The conflict became deeply personal when Linda Morrison started spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood with the dedication of a tabloid journalist. She told anyone who would listen that I was a troublemaker who would bring down everyone's property values with my fortress-like barrier that screams antisocial behavior. She positioned herself as the guardian of community standards, protecting innocent families from my allegedly destructive influence. Her campaign included door-to-door visits where she warned neighbors that someone who needed that much privacy might be involved in illegal activities. Normal people don't need 6-foot fences unless they're hiding something, she would whisper conspiratorially. Drug dealers love privacy, and she's always on that computer doing who knows what. The rumors grew more elaborate with each telling, eventually including suggestions that I might be running some kind of online criminal enterprise from my home office. Mrs. Patterson, the sweet 70-year-old widow next door, quietly informed me that Morrison was actively trying to organize a neighborhood boycott against me. She's telling everyone you're trying to destroy the community character, dear, Mrs. Patterson whispered during one of our fence-side conversations, glancing around nervously as if Linda might be listening from behind a bush. She's even suggesting you might be dealing drugs, because why else would you need so much privacy? It's absolutely ridiculous, but some people are starting to believe her. The social isolation campaign was surprisingly effective, with several neighbors who'd previously been friendly suddenly avoiding eye contact when I walked by. The Hendersons stopped waving from their front yard, the family across the street pulled their children inside whenever I appeared, and even the mail carrier started giving me suspicious looks when delivering packages. The situation reached a boiling point when I was nearly finished with the fence installation. I woke up one morning to find someone had spray-painted bright red graffiti across several of my fence boards, with the words, "Tear it down," dripping down the cedar like blood. The vandalism had been done with the kind of careful precision that suggested someone wanted maximum visual impact without technically entering my property. Fortunately, I'd installed security cameras after the harassment started, and the footage clearly showed a familiar figure in a pink hoodie skulking around my property at 3:17 in the morning. The video was crystal clear, showing Linda Morrison checking over her shoulder multiple times before shaking a can of spray paint and carefully tagging my fence boards. She'd even brought newspaper to put under the fence to avoid getting paint on the grass, showing this wasn't a spontaneous act of vandalism, but a premeditated attack. When I confronted Linda Morrison with a printout from the video the next morning, she flat out denied everything, despite the evidence being undeniable. That could be anyone in a pink hoodie, she insisted, even though the video clearly showed her distinctive bleach blonde hair and the specific way she walked, with her clipboard always tucked under her left arm. You probably staged this whole thing to make me look bad and gain sympathy from the neighbors. Her denials became increasingly desperate and hostile. If you don't remove that monstrosity voluntarily, I'll call the police and every city inspector I know, she snarled, abandoning any pretense of civilized discourse. I have connections throughout this county, and you have no idea who you're dealing with. I can make your life miserable in ways you can't even imagine. This neighborhood was peaceful before you arrived with your antisocial behavior and your illegal construction projects. True to her word, Linda Morrison launched what could only be described as a legal assault campaign designed to bury me in bureaucracy and inspection fees. She filed complaints with the City Code Enforcement Office, claiming I was violating dozens of different municipal regulations. She wrote letters to the county commissioner, alleging I was destroying wetlands, despite our neighborhood being nowhere near any protected environmental areas. She even contacted our congressman's office, claiming I was violating federal housing standards and possibly running an unlicensed business from my home. Each complaint triggered automatic investigations, requiring multiple government agencies to send inspectors to investigate her claims. Every inspection meant I had to take hours off work to meet with officials, explain the situation, and properly permitted. The inspectors were professional, but clearly frustrated at being called out for frivolous complaints. "Ma'am, your fence is textbook legal," the city code enforcement officer told me after his third visit. "Whoever is filing these complaints is wasting taxpayer resources on harassment. You might want to consider filing a counter-complaint for abuse of the system." But what Mrs. Morrison didn't realize was that I was meticulously documenting every interaction, recording every phone call where legally permitted, and photographing every piece of correspondence she sent. More importantly, during my research into HOA regulations, I'd discovered some very interesting irregularities in how Linda Morrison had been managing our community association. With my background in compliance auditing from my previous job, I knew exactly what red flags to look for, and Mrs. Morrison's operation was practically a parade of violations waiting to be exposed. Financial discrepancies, procedural violations, and abuse of authority were everywhere once I knew where to look. The 911 call this morning was just the final piece of evidence I needed to bring down her entire house of cards. Linda Morrison had finally pushed too far, and she was about to discover that terrorizing the wrong person could have consequences she'd never imagined. When Officer Martinez approached my property, I calmly reached into my wallet and pulled out my identification. But it wasn't just a regular driver's license, it was an official badge with the number 1847 and the words State Compliance Auditor, Department of Housing and Community Development, engraved in silver letters that caught the morning sunlight like a beacon of authority. Good morning, Officer Martinez. I'm Senior Auditor Sarah Mitchell, currently conducting an investigation into HOA violations in this area under state authority, I said in my most professional voice, the same tone I used when interviewing non-compliant housing managers. The transformation in Linda Morrison's expression was instantaneous and dramatic. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint right there on her perfectly manicured lawn. Officer Martinez examined my credentials carefully, turning the badge over in his hands and checking the holographic security features that marked it as genuine state identification. His entire demeanor shifted as he realized he wasn't dealing with a simple neighbor dispute, but a situation involving a state official conducting legitimate government business. "Ma'am, you called 911 to report a threat to community security?" he asked Linda Morrison, his voice now carrying a note of skepticism that hadn't been there moments before. "That's absolutely right," she stammered, though her voice had lost most of its earlier confidence and taken on a shrill, desperate quality. "She's building that fence illegally and refusing to follow HOA rules. She's disrupting our entire community." But I was already pulling out a comprehensive folder containing my building permit from the city, a professional survey report, the HOA bylaws with relevant sections highlighted in yellow, and something that made Linda Morrison's eyes widen in pure terror. The preliminary audit report on the Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association was 3 inches thick and bound in an official state government cover with security watermarks. "Officer, over the past 6 weeks, I've received 23 violation notices from Mrs. Morrison, none of which have any legal basis," I explained, handing him the meticulously organized documentation. It represents a clear pattern of harassment against a state employee conducting official duties. Additionally, my preliminary audit has uncovered numerous serious violations in how this HOA is being managed. I opened my laptop, which I'd brought outside anticipating this exact moment, and connected it to a portable printer I'd set up on my patio table. "The financial irregularities alone are staggering," I continued, printing out bank statements and check registers that told a story of systematic financial abuse. Mrs. Morrison has approved contracts worth $47,000 without proper board votes, including a massive landscaping contract with a company owned by her own son. Officer Martinez accepted the documents with growing interest, his law enforcement training helping him recognize the significance of what he was seeing. The procedural violations were equally damning. In the past 18 months, only 2 of 8 board meetings had followed proper legal notice requirements, with most decisions being made through private email exchanges that violated California's open meeting laws designed to ensure community transparency. "This is completely legal neighborhood management," Linda Morrison protested, but her voice cracked with panic as she watched her carefully constructed authority crumbling in real time. "I've been protecting this community for 6 years. She's just trying to destroy everything we've built because she doesn't want to follow the rules." But Officer Martinez was now studying the evidence with the focused attention of someone who recognized potential criminal activity when he saw it. The real bombshell was her abuse of enforcement powers, which I documented with mathematical precision. Mrs. Morrison has issued 347 violation notices in the past year alone, which is 6 times higher than comparable HOAs in our county, I explained, showing him statistical analysis that revealed the scope of her reign of terror. 89% of those notices had no valid basis in the governing documents, representing systematic harassment designed to intimidate residents into compliance with her personal preferences rather than actual community rules. The turning point came when Mr. Peterson, our retired city planner who lived across the street, walked over to join the conversation after watching the police cars arrive. "Officer, I can confirm everything Ms. Mitchell is telling you," he said firmly, his professional background lending weight to his testimony. "We've been complaining about Mrs. Morrison's tactics for years, but no one knew how to stop her. She rules this neighborhood through intimidation and fear, issuing bogus violations to anyone who questions her authority. Then, Mrs. Patterson appeared with her tablet computer, looking more determined than I'd ever seen the gentle widow who had become my closest ally in this fight. "Officer Martinez, I need to report a crime," she announced with surprising steel in her voice. "Someone vandalized Sarah's fence last night, and I have video evidence of exactly who did it." She played the high-definition footage that clearly showed Linda Morrison in her distinctive pink hoodie, spray painting my fence at 3:17 in the morning, checking over her shoulder multiple times to make sure she wasn't being observed. "That's not me," Linda Morrison protested weakly, but Officer Martinez was already looking at the paint stains on the sleeves of the pink hoodie she was currently wearing, the same distinctive hoodie from the video, complete with matching paint splatters that she'd apparently forgotten to wash off. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions about vandalism charges," he said, reaching for his handcuffs with the methodical efficiency of an officer who'd made thousands of arrests. But I wasn't finished yet. "Officer, there's one more thing," I said, opening another file on my laptop that contained legal research I'd prepared specifically for this moment. Under California Civil Code 5980, Mrs. Morrison's abuse of emergency services by filing a false police report about a supposed community threat could result in misdemeanor charges for misuse of 911 services. I paused for effect, watching her face crumble as she realized the full scope of her legal troubles was only beginning. "And when I submit my complete audit report to the State Department next week, if these violations are confirmed, Willowbrook Gardens HOA will face state intervention for financial mismanagement," I continued, delivering the final blow with professional calm. "Mrs. Morrison could be charged with embezzlement, abuse of fiduciary duty, and violation of state housing laws. The Attorney General's office takes HOA corruption very seriously, especially when it involves misappropriation of community funds. The woman who terrorized our neighborhood for 6 years was finally facing someone with the knowledge, authority, and documentation to fight back, and she was completely powerless to stop what was coming next." The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Thursday evening, after news of Linda Morrison's arrest for vandalism had spread throughout our small community like wildfire. The community center had never seen such a crowd, 67 homeowners packed into a space designed for maybe 40 people, with folks standing along the walls and sitting in folding chairs borrowed from the local church. The air was thick with tension and anticipation as neighbors who'd suffered under Linda Morrison's rule for years finally saw a chance for justice. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying my laptop, a portable projector I'd borrowed from work, and a stack of documents that represented months of careful investigation into our HOA's operations. The evidence was so comprehensive that it filled 3 bankers' boxes, each one labeled and organized with the precision of someone who'd built legal cases for a living. Patterson and Mr. Peterson had claimed seats in the front row, both wearing expressions of grim determination that reminded me why I'd grown to love this community, despite all the drama. The rest of the crowd was clearly divided into 2 camps, those who still believed Linda Morrison was protecting their property values, and those who wanted to know the truth about what had really been happening behind the scenes. Conversations buzzed throughout the room as neighbors compared notes about their own experiences with arbitrary violations and harassment. "She fined me $50 because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to her husband. "I had to repaint it 3 times before she approved the color." Linda Morrison herself arrived 10 minutes late, no longer wearing her signature pink hoodie, but dressed in a severe black business suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral, which, in many ways, she was. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy that manifested. "This meeting has been called to address the malicious allegations being made against me," she began, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her authority in front of people who'd once feared her clipboard and violation notices. "I have served this community faithfully for 6 years, sacrificing my own time and energy to maintain the property values and community standards that make Willowbrook Gardens a desirable place to live. I will not stand by while an outsider attempts to destroy everything we've built together through lies and manipulation." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 67 pairs of eyes watching my every move, and connected my laptop to the projector with the deliberate precision of someone who'd prepared for this moment for weeks. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm requesting permission to present findings from the state audit I've been conducting under official government authority," I said clearly, making sure everyone in the room could hear every word. "You have no authority in this room," she snapped back, but her voice cracked on the last word as she realized her power was already gone. "Actually," I replied, clicking my laptop and watching the first slide appear on the wall in letters large enough for everyone to read, Under California Civil Code 5200, any homeowner has the right to review HOA financial records and question management practices during open meetings. More importantly, as a state auditor conducting an official investigation, I have the legal authority to present findings of potential criminal activity to affected community members. The slide displayed in large letters read, Willowbrook Gardens HOA State Compliance Audit Findings, and the murmur that went through the room told me that many people still hadn't fully grasped that I was actually a state auditor with real government authority. During my 8-week investigation, I've uncovered a systematic pattern of financial mismanagement, procedural violations, and abuse of authority that threaten the legal standing of this entire community, I announced, clicking to the next slide that showed a summary of violations so extensive it filled the entire wall. What I'm about to show you represents the most comprehensive case of HOA corruption I've encountered in 5 years of state auditing work. The room fell completely silent as people realized they were about to learn the truth about years of suspicious activities they'd never been allowed to question. The first major finding detailed the financial irregularities that would soon land Linda Morrison in serious legal trouble with both state and federal authorities. Mrs. Morrison has approved 14 different contracts totaling $127,000 without proper board votes, in direct violation of your community's governing documents, I explained, displaying bank statements and check copies on the wall with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Most notably, she authorized a $47,000 payment to Morrison Landscaping LLC, a company registered under her son's name just 2 weeks before the first payment was issued. The gasps and angry mutters from the audience grew louder as people saw the documentary evidence of what amounted to theft from their own community funds, money that came from their monthly HOA fees and was supposed to be used for legitimate community improvements. This represents a clear conflict of interest that constitutes embezzlement under California Penal Code, I continued, showing copies of corporate registration documents that proved the landscaping company was owned by Linda Morrison's family while being paid with community funds. Linda Morrison's face had turned bright red, but she tried to maintain her defiance even as the evidence mounted against her. That was legitimate business. This community needed professional landscaping services, and my son's company provided excellent work at competitive rates. But Mr. Davis, one of the board members who'd been kept in the dark about these expenditures, stood up with obvious anger radiating from every line of his body. Linda, why didn't any of us know about these contracts? We're supposed to vote on anything over $5,000 according to our own bylaws. The second finding was equally damaging, a systematic violation of California's open meeting laws that had effectively disenfranchised every homeowner in our community for the past 2 years. In the past 18 months, only 2 of 8 board meetings followed proper notice requirements, I continued, showing email screenshots that proved most decisions were made through private communications that excluded community input and violated state transparency laws. The remaining 6 meetings were either canceled without proper notice or conducted through private email exchanges between board members, making it impossible for homeowners to participate in decisions affecting their properties and investments. Mrs. Chen, who'd been trying unsuccessfully for months to get answers about community spending, shouted out with frustration that had been building for years. So we've been living under a dictatorship this whole time. No wonder she never answered our questions about where our money was going. The room erupted in angry conversations as neighbors compared notes about their own failed attempts to get information about HOA finances and decision-making processes that had been hidden from them through systematic violations of state law. The third finding revealed the scope of Linda Morrison's abuse of power through her enforcement practices, which had turned living in Willowbrook Gardens into a nightmare of constant surveillance and arbitrary punishment. Mr. Morrison has issued 347 violation notices in 12 months, 6 times the rate of comparable HOAs in our county, I explained, displaying a chart that showed Willowbrook Gardens as an extreme outlier in a data set of dozens of similar communities. Analysis shows that 89% of these notices had no basis in our governing documents, representing a clear pattern of harassment designed to intimidate residents into compliance with Mrs. Morrison's personal preferences rather than actual community rules. The chart was devastating in its clarity, showing how Linda Morrison had weaponized the violation process to maintain control through fear rather than legitimate community governance. Neighbors throughout the room began calling out their own experiences with bogus violations that had cost them hundreds of dollars in fines for infractions that existed nowhere in the actual HOA rules. She fined me for planting roses because they were the wrong shade of red, called out Mrs. Patterson. She said my garden gnome was a security threat. shouted Mr. Thompson from the back of the room. But the final finding was the one that would seal Linda Morrison's fate and potentially land her in prison for years to come. Most seriously, I've discovered unauthorized access to HOA reserve funds, I announced, bringing up bank statements that showed $20,000 transferred from emergency reserves to Morrison Landscaping, LLC, without any documentation, board approval, or legitimate community purpose. Under California Penal Code, this constitutes felony embezzlement of community funds, punishable by up to 4 years in state prison. The room exploded into chaos, with people shouting questions and demands for explanations, while Linda Morrison sat frozen in her chair like a deer caught in headlights, finally understanding that her years of unchecked power were about to result in serious criminal consequences. When the noise finally died down, Mr. Peterson stood up and made the motion everyone had been waiting for with the solemnity of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Linda Morrison and demand her resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. Second, called out Ms. Patterson, and within minutes we had conducted the fastest, most decisive vote in Willowbrook Gardens history. 52 votes for removal, 8 against, and 7 abstentions from people too stunned by the revelations to make a decision. As Linda Morrison gathered her belongings with trembling hands, she made one final attempt to maintain her dignity and authority in front of people who'd once feared her power. "You'll all regret this decision," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the bitterness of someone who built her identity around controlling others. "This community will fall apart without proper leadership, and your property values will plummet when word gets out about this witch hunt against someone who dedicated her life to protecting your investments." But I had one last announcement that would ensure she could never threaten our community again, delivering it with the calm authority of someone who represented the full power of state government. "Mrs. Morrison, effective immediately, the State Department of Housing and Community Development will be placing Willowbrook Gardens HOA under temporary oversight pending a complete investigation into potential criminal violations," I declared, watching her face crumble as she realized the scope of her legal troubles. "New elections will be conducted within 60 days under state supervision to ensure proper governance going forward, and all financial records will be audited by independent certified public accountants." As the woman who had terrorized our neighborhood for 6 years walked out of the community center for the last time, the only sound was her footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor and the soft closing of the door behind her, marking the end of an era of petty tyranny that had finally met its match. 6 months after that pivotal community meeting, Willowbrook Gardens had transformed into the neighborhood I'd always hoped it could be when I first moved to this quiet suburban street. I stood beside my fence, now officially designated by unanimous community vote as a symbol of residents' rights and community resilience, and marveled at the positive changes that had swept through our small corner of suburbia like a refreshing breeze after years of oppressive humidity. The legal consequences for Linda Morrison had been swift and severe, with the state investigation confirming every single finding in my comprehensive audit report. She'd been charged with embezzlement, vandalism, filing false police reports, and violation of fiduciary duty, ultimately receiving 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a court order to repay $23,000 to the HOA reserves, plus an additional $15,000 in damages and legal fees that would take her years to satisfy. The Morrison family had quietly moved away within 3 months, selling their house below market value as the scandal made them pariahs in a community they'd once dominated through fear and intimidation. Their departure had been so abrupt that neighbors reported seeing a moving truck pull up at dawn one Tuesday morning, loading furniture and boxes with the desperate efficiency of people fleeing a crime scene, which, in many ways, they were. But the real transformation had come in how our neighborhood operated on a daily basis, with changes so dramatic that visitors often commented on the positive energy they felt just walking down our streets. Under state oversight, Willowbrook Gardens had adopted completely new bylaws that emphasized transparency, fairness, and genuine community engagement rather than top-down control and arbitrary enforcement of personal preferences disguised as community rules. Mrs. Patterson had been elected as our interim president, bringing a grandmother's wisdom and genuine care for neighbors to a position that had been corrupted by petty tyranny for far too long. Her first act had been to eliminate the culture of fear that had made homeowners afraid to plant flowers or paint their front doors without written permission from someone who'd turned community service into personal dictatorship. Mr. Peterson, now serving as treasurer with the financial expertise of his city planning background, had implemented monthly financial reports that were published online for every resident to review, complete with detailed explanations of how community funds were being spent and why certain decisions were made. All meeting minutes were made immediately available on our new community website, along with contact information for board members who actually responded to homeowner questions and concerns. Most importantly, the violation process now required documented evidence that violations actually existed in the governing documents, and included a fair appeal procedure that prevented the arbitrary enforcement that had made so many residents afraid to even make minor improvements to their properties. The new system had reduced violation notices by 92%, while actually improving community appearance as people felt free to take pride in their homes again. The changes went far beyond just paperwork and procedures. People were actually enjoying their homes again, making improvements and modifications that reflected their personal tastes rather than one woman's. Shen had planted a beautiful rose garden in colors that would have earned multiple citations under the old regime, while the Johnson family had added a charming front porch swing that brought character to their previously bland facade and provided a gathering place for neighborhood children. Mr. Davis had even built a workshop in his garage for his woodworking hobby, something Linda Morrison had previously forbidden due to noise concerns that existed only in her imagination and her desire to control every aspect of how people used their own property. The sound of his occasional power tool use had been replaced by the laughter of neighbors who stopped by to see his latest creations and share woodworking tips in an atmosphere of genuine community that had been impossible under the previous reign of terror. The most touching moment had come when Mrs. Patterson organized what she called a fence-warming party in my backyard, bringing together the entire community to celebrate not just my privacy fence, but our collective victory over petty authoritarianism that had poisoned neighborhood relationships for years. As neighbors shared food and stories under string lights hung between my fence posts, children played games on my lawn while adults discussed community improvements with the enthusiasm of people who finally felt heard and respected. Mrs. Patterson had made a small speech that brought tears to my eyes and reminded everyone why we'd fought so hard for change. When Sarah moved in, we thought she was just another young professional trying to make a living and maybe start a family in our quiet neighborhood, she'd said, raising a glass of lemonade in a toast that felt like a benediction. We had no idea she was our guardian angel in disguise, sent here to free us from a tyrant none of us knew how to fight on our own. My work with Willowbrook Gardens had also brought unexpected recognition in my professional life, with the State Department of Housing commending my investigation as a textbook example of how to identify and address HOA abuses throughout California. The case study had become required reading for new auditors entering the field, and I'd been promoted to principal auditor with expanded territory covering all of Northern California and responsibility for training other investigators in community association oversight. But more importantly, the experience had opened up a new passion in my life, consulting with homeowners facing similar HOA abuse situations on a pro bono basis, using the tools of law and transparency to help ordinary people fight back against petty tyrants who'd forgotten they were supposed to serve their communities rather than rule them like personal kingdoms. My weekend work helping other neighborhoods had become some of the most fulfilling professional activity of my career. Today, as I sat in my garden behind the fence that had started this whole adventure, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink while neighborhood children played in the distance, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me about the power of preparation, documentation, and standing up for what's right, even when it seems like an impossible fight against entrenched authority. The fence itself had become something of a neighborhood landmark, with children drawing chalk art on the sidewalk beside it, and visitors often asking to take photos with the famous fence that defeated the HOA Karen, as it had become known in online forums where people shared stories of community association abuse. Patterson had even suggested installing a small commemorative plaque, but I'd politely declined. The fence spoke for itself about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated by bullies who think a clipboard and a title give them unlimited power over others. A final surprise had come just last week, when I received a call from the Federal Housing Authority offering me a position leading a national task force investigating HOA abuses across multiple states, with authority to work directly with the Department of Justice on cases involving serious financial crimes. Your work has shown that individual homeowners don't have to be victims of corrupt community associations, the director had explained during our hour-long phone conversation. I want to scale your approach nationwide to help communities across America reclaim their rights from petty dictators who've forgotten the meaning of public service. I'd accepted the position immediately, knowing that somewhere out there, other neighborhoods were suffering under their own versions of Linda Morrison, and they deserved someone who knew exactly how to document their abuses, expose their violations, and restore power to the people who actually lived in these communities and paid the fees that funded these associations. Standing beside my 6-foot cedar fence in the fading light, I smiled, thinking about all the future communities I'd help liberate from their own petty dictators, one carefully documented violation at a time, because sometimes the best defense against tyranny is simply knowing your rights and refusing to be afraid of someone whose only real power comes from other people's ignorance and fear.